Okay. Hi, everyone. Lovely to see so many people joining us today, and thanks so much for coming. It's affirming to see so many people interested in messaging around a well-being economy. So this guide, so over the last few months, Positive Money, Neon, Perk, and We All um, have been working together to develop this guide that we hope supports sort of the broader well-being economy movement. And this guide's gone through a series of different iterations, and we hope to discuss ways in which this guide can be useful to you all and your work. And our goal here is to step up our collective game. If we begin to start like talking in the same language, that can be very powerful. And the language that we use does matter quite a lot. So especially once we all begin to sing in sync with each other. Plus, we also need to be clear about what we mean when we talk about a well-being economy, because as it continues to be used, it can mean everything and nothing. And so to make sure that it doesn't become like that becomes a term that is clear and that has that's clear. So this guide shares a vision for a different economic system that fundamentally changes structures and not just adjusts them. Luckily, much of this change is already happening. So last year, actually, the term well-being economy was Googled 97% more in 2020 than it was in 2019. And we're already seeing governments take the lead in integrating the well-being economy deeper in their agendas. And with the convergence of multiple crises happening that we've seen in 2020, the case for a well-being economy is being made for us. So it's overdue that we need to develop a well-being economy, like in our own areas and also globally. So thank you all for joining us. And hopefully we'll continue to sort of build this base of power that can then be the actors for change and really turn the needle. So I'm Isabel. I work with the Wellbeing Economy Alliance as the engagement and content lead. And so We All, or the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, is a collaboration of organizations and alliances, movements, individuals, all working toward building a well-being economy and delivering human and ecological well-being. Also with me today, or in the group today, we've got Dora, who works with Neon as the head of messaging. So the New Economy Organizers Network, or Neon, is an independent network of activists working to replace neoliberalism with an economy and politics based on social and economic justice. And then also Rachel, who works with Positive Money as the head of campaigns and organizing. And Positive Money's mission is to promote a fair, democratic, and sustainable economy through reforms of central banks and alternative monetary policy tools. And so thank you all for being here. And I'm going to pass over to Dora, who is going to give us a bit of an overview and presentation. Dora, you're muted. Oh, sorry. Yes, you need to be allowed to unmute. That would be good. There you go. I apologize.
Hey. Hello, everyone. Lovely to see you. I'm now going to attempt another tech situation, which could go wrong, but hopefully not. Right. I'm just going to try and share my screen. Anna, can you see that? Yeah? Okay. Thank you so much for asking me to come and share the Wellbeing Economy messaging guide. And it's fantastic to see so many of you here today. I'm going to we're going to share the guide with you. I'm going to what I'm going to do today is kind of pick out some of the key bits that I think are particularly sort of important, but also applicable. But just to sort of say that the guide has a lot of information in it that I'm not going to cover, and also, it goes into more depth. But we will have time to kind of chat and have some questions afterwards as well. So yeah, I'm the head of messaging at Neon. My work within Neon sits within the comms hub, and really the focus of our work, and what I focus on, is kind of how do we develop and deploy messages that resonate. So really messages that will cut through the noise on a day, but also fundamentally shift the conversation in a more progressive direction. And one of the offers or ways that we do that, let's see if I can change my slides.
Dora, can you
Um,
speak up a little bit louder?
yeah, sure.
Thank
Sorry,
you.
I'll move this a
No
bit.
worries.
Is that better?
Perfect.
Okay, sure. So one of the ways that sort of the offerings that we have in the Comms Hub at Neon is a messaging day. And this is a day-long workshop that we developed in collaboration with Perk. Um, and we delivered one of these at the end of last year on the wellbeing economy. So this is like over one day, we bring campaigners together who work on the same issue, but might work across a number of organizations and groups. And we kind of go through in a very quick, sort of rapid way, a framing or messaging process. So together we try to clarify, like, what's our story? What is it that we're wanting to say on this issue? Um, we grapple with audience insights. So we kind of look at some bits of public perception research to kind of think about what do people think about this issue, but also really importantly, like, how are people thinking about this issue? And then together we develop new messages. And off the back of that messaging day, we write a messaging guide. And that's something that we shape and hone as kind of from Neon and Perk, who work on messaging and communications, but it is, as Isabel said, an iterative process that we work on together. So, see if this. So I guess just very quickly, like, but why are we here? Why do we need to focus on communications at all? Why are we here to kind of think about that? Can't we just say what we want to say or present compelling evidence to persuade people of our point of view? And it is unfortunate but true that it's just, and as I'm sure everyone on this call is well aware, it's just not that damn simple. The decision to focus on communications really begins with the realization that when we say something, it isn't always received in the way that we intend. Humans are messy, we're often contradictory, we are irrational, we hold a whole load of existing values, ideas, beliefs. And when we hear new pieces of information, as in the slide, the triangle, that piece of information gets filtered through that kind of bundle of stuff that's in our heads. So to communicate effectively, we need to kind of have an awareness of this. We need to not just think about what we want to say, we need to think about how is it going to be received. So to give a really quick example, this comes from a piece of like quite kind of speedy analysis that was done by our friends over at Frameworks Institute of a campaign that was trying to raise awareness of high levels of sugar in products that were being marketed towards children. And the aim of the campaign was to raise awareness of that and put pressure on the government to regulate kind of these companies. But what they found from the reactions on, oh, sorry, going the wrong way. But what they found from the reactions on social media is that the campaign was really misfiring, that when people saw pictures of children with rotting teeth, actually the response that people had, or the kind of key frame that it kind of triggered for people, was one of parental neglect. And so on social media, what they saw was actually the big outpouring was of kind of, these children aren't being looked after properly, and they weren't directing their blame towards the companies or the government to do anything about that. So it's just that's why we need to keep these things in mind. And it's also true that context of how we present the information is really essential in where people land in terms of their thinking about something. So people can see things from multiple perspectives, and they can toggle between different perspectives. And our objective as communicators is to get people to toggle to the most progressive position that they can do and kind of hold them there. So in terms of where we got to with the wellbeing economy messaging guide, and this is an incredibly, and probably will come of no surprise to the people on this call, so that from the kind of headlines, I guess, in terms of the sort of audience perception research, and we talk about this often in terms of narrative opportunities and also the narrative challenges that we face. So I don't think it's going to come as like a surprise to people that to hear, we've seen polling that suggests there is a real kind of increased excitement or like support for prioritizing well-being and the climate over economic growth. And we are seeing that, and I think that so it would be a really interesting conversation to maybe have after this, is that what the pandemic offers in terms of like an opportunity to inject this narrative like has opened up. And I think we're going to have to see how that pans out in terms of the recession that's coming, but there is a moment here. But I think it's also important to flag that when we're talking about something that growth is a very dominant metaphor that people rely on to understand the economic system, and the kind of inbuilt in our understanding of growth is that it's conceptualized as both natural and good. And it does what I've said here as a kind of the conceptual heavy lifting. And one of the findings, so I worked on a Framing the Economy project, which was a 2-year project on the economy. And a key finding really, which I mean, was that people struggle to conceptualize and understand the economy, right? We actually find it a very difficult topic to sort of grapple with. So I think it's just worth this flagging that the growth is something that provides a scaffolding for people in terms of understanding how the economy should function. And so it's just that is definitely the challenge that we're facing as well-being, kind of as campaigners who are looking to in some way kind of inject our messaging into this debate. So I'm just gonna kind of get into what we put forward, and I put them down to 4 tips for talking about a well-being economy. And I'm gonna just go through them. I'm sorry, apologies, I'm having a slide malfunction. Okay, so one thing, a kind of the classic default way in which the kind of progressive arguments are often presented is something along the lines of like, here's a problem and here's another problem, and here's a lot of details about why this is a really big problem, and then like, here's a solution. And the problem is with, as Anat Shenker-Osorio says, who's a comms expert in the States that I'm sure many of you will be aware of, what she says is the problem with problems is we don't want more of them, right? Like if you're trying to tell someone about, you want someone to come with you on an argument, you want some, to invite someone into a bigger conversation, really what we're wanting to do is open with a point of connection, and opening by kind of forefronting a value that we share. And this is partly about kind of an invitation in. But also when we're thinking about something like the wellbeing economy, we're really also asking people to we want people to reflect on their sort of entrenched beliefs and deeply held values. So, and this is what we found in testing and in comms research, leading with a shared value really makes the difference on that. Specifically from the Framing the Economy project, what we found was that the value of fulfillment was particularly effective in moving people to support an economy that went beyond money. And that was, again, another finding was a kind of that often people, when they talked about the economy, they just saw economy equals money. That is what all the economy should be doing, is kind of, it was a lot of like metaphors around circulation, getting money to where it needs to go. But if we're wanting to have a different type of conversation about what the economy is and what it should be doing, by forefronting values and particularly asking this question about what does it mean to have a meaningful and fulfilling life, we're really broadening the focus of the conversation. So the actual the messaging guide opens with this: a good economy is one that makes it possible for everyone to lead a meaningful and fulfilling life. And that's a job for us as communicators and campaigners, is how do we spell that out? What does that look like for people in language that's accessible and in language that people are going to resonate? Okay, so the second thing that came out is in the guide and from our kind of research, is that a well-being economy is about the well-being of people and planet, right? It's not of the economy itself. We know that the well-being of ordinary citizens and the growth of the economy do not necessarily correlate. So a conversation about the well-being economy needs to forefront people. And what we find is that within this subject matter, there is such rich metaphorical language that's used, and a lot of that metaphorical language that is used of the economy depicts it as a living organism or as a naturally occurring state. So even think, about growth, what that kind of communicates to us. Similarly, the idea that we often think of it as a weather condition or that it's like, a medical condition. So think recovery, for example. And each of these kind of metaphors asserts that the economy is outside of our control. So it's something that fundamentally we are at the whim of, rather than something that we are able to change. So by putting people in the picture with one kind of forefronting like real lives, which is obviously very important and a really important communication tool, but also we're shifting this idea that rather than the economy being something that we should service or soothe, that actually we should be in the driving seat of the economy, and that is what it's there, that really the economy is there for us. So this is just a bugbear, but I'm going to put it in, which is I would like, and it's also a challenge for you guys to look through your communications and find ways in which you are basically hiding people. Where are you saying something like public services rather than talking about doctors, nurses, teachers? And I think that if like, it's just something that I think as progressives we do all the time. It's like jargon and acronyms are obviously a classic one, but I also think we use kind of empty language which just doesn't mean things to most people, but really importantly actually hides very, very compelling stories. Okay, so number 3 is talk about how the economy is designed, and in doing so talk about how it's redesigned. I put this picture in of this chair because it's someone behind me in a co-working space has this chair, and it's a very designed chair. Before seeing this chair, I would have never really thought about the fact that chairs were designed at all. It wouldn't have crossed my mind. I see them every day. It just wouldn't have made me think about it. And this was a central thing for the Framing the Economy project, which comes up again, is that people don't think of the economy as designed. Following on from all this metaphorical language of weather, of medical conditions, essentially there's a big issue of agency, and people just don't think that if we can build the idea that the economy has been designed, that it is of human design, then we can equally build the idea that it can be redesigned, and that essentially that is our job to do. And it shifts this idea of basically what our role is to play. And I guess just following on from that, and again this is from across all of the social issues that I research on, and what blocks kind of people from supporting us is it's often fatalism is the kind of pervasive attitude. So they may believe you that they will agree that the economy is not serving their needs. They will agree that things should change, or that inequality the gap within inequality is too wide. But the main thing that will come back at us is, but nothing is ever going to change. And how will I ever change it? And I think the economy, because of the nature of this, because of lots of other elements of it, is a kind of classic one where people feel completely unable to influence it. So by talking about the economy as being designed, we can also talk about it as being redesigned. And again, just in a very simple ways, we can look at how in our messaging are we adopting passive language, or kind of shying away from showing exactly how that could be the case. So just as a very small example, talking about, rather than the government, we're talking about this government, showing how specific policies lead to outcomes and making that kind of connection for people. So yeah, again, this is from the messaging guide that we'll share with you. But so as an example, we're saying, sorry, it seems like, yeah, right now our economic system doesn't help steer us through the challenging times. Instead, the system has been designed to fixate on profit and growth, taking us down a dangerous and short-sighted path. The impact is clear to see, from a widening gap between the rich and poor to environmental breakdown and the mental health crisis. The current economic system is harming us all. Okay, so the final one I wanted to say, and a point that comes from our, that is outlined in the messaging guide, is a kind of recommendation to try using the journey, a metaphor of a journey, to talk about the economy. And again, this is, this is to kind of acknowledge that it's really hard to look through all of the metaphorical language that's adopted around the economy right now and sidestep it all, because it is so rich. Once you begin to see it, it's kind of just, yeah, we're wading through it basically. But this this recommendation comes from both the Framing the Economy project, in which we tested a metaphor about economic tracks, so laying down the kind of tracks that we just kind of get us to where we want to go. And it has also been recommended across other projects as well. And I think the thing that's important here really is that this metaphor helps us to talk about what's the direction that we want to travel. and sort of, is the economy helping us to get to where we want to go? So it kind of, and I guess with the well-being economy, what we're talking about really is to kind of arrive at meaningful lives. You know, it's like it kind of opens up the space to talk about those things. So yeah, just to say that in the Framing the Economy project, we actually had the opportunity to test this metaphor around economic tracks, and it was found to be really sticky, but also very much specifically what we found in the testing is that it got people to this idea that the economy had been designed, and the design redesign idea came out really strongly. So again, to give you a kind of example from the messaging guide, we have, we know there will be difficult times, losing our job, caring for a loved one, falling ill, everyone hits bumps in the road. We need an economic system that helps us to absorb these shocks and get back on track as quickly as possible. And then in terms of putting forward the solution, by putting people and health first, we can steer the economy in the right direction and lay a new path to a well-being economy. So it's just an example of how we've kind of applied that in the guide itself. So yeah, just I guess in a recap of those being that we need to kind of lead with shared values, put people in the picture wherever possible, but also in the driving seat of what we're saying about who should control the economy and what it should be serving. Talking about the design of the economy as much as possible to build the belief that we can redesign it and that something can be done about it, and to use the metaphor of a journey to help in doing that. I'll just say that I've really focused here on, I think, like the kind of key framing principles and how we've applied them in the core message of the guide. But we also, in the guide itself, we have kind of do's and don'ts, words to use, words to avoid, and kind of some of the common attacks that come up time and time again, and a kind of suggestion of how we can respond to those. So like there's a lot more in the guide to unpack, but I just thought these were the kind of juicy bits to jump into here together and that we can talk about. So yeah, that's from me.
Lovely. Thank you so much. Let me remove your spotlight also. Perfect. Okay. Great. Well, we now are sort of going to transition into a Q&A. So how I'm going to run this, first of all, I just am so glad that there are so many people here today. And Dora, that was really very helpful. So thank you. So in order to run this Q&A, I think most effectively, I'm going to ask you all, if you have questions, to write them in the chat. And I will sort of scan the chat and call on you either to unmute yourself and ask the question, or I will summarize, like if some of the questions are the same, I might summarize on your behalf. So if you all have any questions, I would definitely encourage you to write some of those in the chat. And then we're also going to share the guide, obviously, but I get a little, I want to make sure that we're all here present instead of sending you off to go read a document. So please, pop some questions in the chat. So Robert, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hello, sorry, I've got the light right behind me so you can't see me. Yeah, that was really fantastic, thank you. Yeah, so just a bit of context, I work for Extinction Rebellion, and one of the issues we have thinking about this sometimes is using words like capitalism and the reactive kind of nature of those things. Like, are those things that came up in your research? Were they things you tried to actively avoid, or you found were particularly did they set people off, I suppose, or was that something you really covered?
Dora, do you want to try and answer that question?
Yeah, I mean, that isn't something that we tested in the Framing the Economy project, and and with the Wellbeing project, we haven't been able to kind of test any specific messages on this kind of this. So I think it's a tricky one, right? Because I think I'd guard against it's a matter of balance, and I think it's very difficult to say to say definitely one way or the other. And I think the key thing for me on this is that we do need to have our eye. We're wanting to kind of connect in with as many people as possible. We want to also communicate in a way that is as accessible as possible. And I think even if it's about questioning, like, what does capitalism have, like, kind of, you know, how does it hold a meaning for people, or is it kind of inviting people into a conversation? Are there ways that we can talk about what, you know, other ways that we can unpack that term, which actually is a lot more kind of, which relates to people's day-to-day lives and experiences, I think is one thing. I do think, though, you know, our messaging needs to kind of excite the base of people that we're hoping are going to share the messages and that are going to be out there kind of having these conversations. So I'm not someone who thinks that our communications needs to kind of like triangulate or kind of sort of dampen down our message. But I think that I think it's really important to scrutinize the language that we're relying on and really ask ourselves, is that the best way of saying it? And does that mean to other people what it does to me? And often I think, as in the progressive movement, you know, space, we are quite lazy with some of that language, or we're kind of used to using it with people where it's a shared understanding. So I think it's about kind of being quite critical really with ourselves on those sorts of terms.
Yeah, I agree with everything. And I would just add also, like, I think often it's hard to, like, that's the old system. So that's also really focused on the problem. And so I think a lot of the goal here is to help people envision a better future. And so focusing on more of what that vision looks like and what markets could look like in a well-being economy, as opposed to just demonizing, you know, the old system that is a market system, right? So I'm going to read a question here. Can you give any more examples of the common ground starting point and what shared values we lead with? I'm going to take this one because We All has done a bit of work around what we call the We All needs. So these are the 5 We All needs, and I'm going to attach a photograph of what these needs are in the chat. And this has actually served, I've noticed, you know, more and more how important having these are. So it's dignity, nature, connection, fairness, and participation. So I'm just putting in the chat a photograph that shows all of those things. And so that was also designed through sort of an iterative process with our membership. And it's a very useful go-to document or resource to sort of say these are the values that underpin the well-being economy. So now I'm going to switch. Joanna, do you want to unmute yourself and ask a question?
Yes, I just wondered whether well-being economy was jargon. It's a word that we're bandying around, but when you're talking to an audience outside the bubble, do people actually know what we mean by well-being economy?
Yeah, great question. Go ahead, Dora. Yeah.
I guess, I mean, one thing that seems to have come out from some of the research is that well-being did have the idea that well-being can kind of be maximized or minimized is kind of an element of it that is useful, that like we can have an economy that is kind of better for well-being or not. So I think there are some, and I think, you know, it's always difficult with these things because it's always useful to test these different terms, but also testing can, you know, it not be conclusive as well, and it needs to work for this kind of group of people and the wider audience. So but I think I guess it's also whether it's got enough traction currently, and it's good just to get behind something. But I think I think that well-being, from my perspective of just very, very personally, has like some quite useful components within it for talking about an economic system.
Do we have to unpack what well-being actually is, or is it something? I mean, if you said something like kindness, people would automatically know what you meant. Or if you said something like good health, they would know that. But do they, if you mention them, your well-being, do they know what you mean, or is it one of these rather fuzzy words that actually they would have difficulty saying exactly what it meant?
Yeah, I can sort of speak to that. I mean, I think yes, and I mean it depends, right? Like some people well-being really resonates, others probably maybe not. But I think this is where that word flourishing comes in. So you use sort of a number of different phrases that support that word. But for example, like when we talk about if it's happiness versus well-being, well-being kind of polls better than the term happiness. And it feels like happiness is also like your own personal experience, as opposed to maybe well-being being something that's more measured. And I do think that it's a good question. And I'm not like, I think this is a part of sort of the work. And sort of to my point earlier of when we use a well-being economy, is it just going to be washed just as sustainability, right, or inclusivity? We need to make sure that we're putting more definition around that. So that is sort of the task at hand, is making sure that that word is understood and not misconstrued. But this is, yeah, I think a part of sort of this process that we're going through. I'm gonna ask.
I've got a couple of thoughts on that one as well, if that's now's useful time. But Dora, I think it would be useful for you to either back me up or or not on what I'm about to say. But this is definitely like something that came up during the workshop, and a few people have asked. And I think in some ways one of the beauties of the word well-being is that it can cover a lot of things, but essentially, you know, there's if you're talking about it in purely like what does that economic system look like, basically the well-being economy is a much better phrase to use as opposed to things like degrowth or post-growth or clean growth or green growth, because all of those things feed into that frame that we saw in Dora's presentation, but also, you know, that can then open up a whole load of other questions as well. And there basically has been this kind of a lot of discussion around what's the best term to use, but as lots of people are probably already aware on the call, there is already a kind of well-being economy growing movement and a well-being economy governments alliance. So it seems like it's the right direction of travel, and the conversation needs to be around well-being economy. Great, what is this? Let's move towards it. It's exciting. It's a word that appeals.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel. I'm going to ask, so Donald asks the question, do you find donut economics as a useful and accessible concept? Very quickly, like, yes, absolutely. It is a very useful and accessible concept framework. It's used widely. It absolutely supports this work. It's very important. Kate Rayworth is incredible. So just to answer that very quickly, and then I'm going to ask Morven, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question? And then I'm going to go to Roger and Juliet.
Sure, thanks. My name's Morven. I work at a charity called Sustain, and we do work around the food and farming system. We work on things from food poverty to better food economies for everyone, to kind of free school meals, to lots of things. And my question was really about kind of messaging specifically aimed at people in positions of power currently, so this government, and kind of people who might have ideological preconceptions that tie them much more strongly to the way in which our economy currently functions, and to that concept of they actually have vested interests in the idea that the economy is this natural force, and that growth is a good thing. So it's not just kind of, oh, that's what we kind of understand it to be, but they've actually thought about it quite a lot, and that is still their understanding. And whether then there's a difference in kind of messaging, because as a campaigner, I think trying to cut through the noise, and you know, you use things like this will stimulate jobs because you know that it might make a Tory politician sit up and listen, but then in the back of your head there's kind of, will this actually kind of perpetuate the problem in the longer term? So yeah, it was just kind of a bit of a a question about how you might tailor messaging for conservative politicians in particular.
Yeah. Rachel, or Dora, actually, you just unmuted yourself. Go for it.
No. Rachel, do you want to come in first?
You go for it, Dora.
No, I mean, I think it's a really good question, and it's always easy to talk about, I'm in the very privileged position of talking about communications in the abstract, and actually when you're kind of applying this stuff is where you really kind of have to work through those things. I do think, though, that we to caution against it, I think of this a bit of like, in sort of famous quote of like in Mad Men of Donald Draper, who says, if you don't like what's being said, change the conversation. And I think sometimes we do also need to, I do think your concern about that is a good one, in that it's we can end up being so interested in trying to communicate with people who are like opposing us on something, that we end up kind of spending a lot of time and energy there versus kind of building up the thing that we're wanting to kind of what we're wanting to say, essentially, and the kind of point we're trying to put forward. But Rach, I think you've probably got a good insight in that from the positive money perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with what you've just said, Dora, and it certainly feels more energizing to focus energy on the fact that, like, we know that at least 2/3 of the public are really on board with moving towards this, and most people kind of share the values and the outcomes that we want, so that's really positive. But it's definitely, a bigger, takes time to build the conversation, and I think that the more people we can start singing from this hymn sheet, then the bigger this movement gets, and the more legitimacy it will get with the people who are perhaps hardest to reach. But totally take the point that there are some people whose ideology completely contradicts some of what a wellbeing economy might be about, and that it's important when talking to those audiences that you don't go straight to the kind of we need to stop all growth point, but it might be that you start talking about it in the things that appeal earliest on. So I think that rather than saying we need to, to those specific audiences, rather than perhaps going hard on that we need to stop targeting GDP growth, you go hard on the why don't we start targeting social and health well-being outcomes as well as, if that makes sense. So that's some of the ways that we're thinking this.
Thank you. I'm going to quickly address Roger's question and then ask Julia to unmute, because I think Rachel just touched a little bit on this. And also a quick plug that WeAll is hosting a webinar on Friday that deep dives into GDP. So the question is, GDP is a measure of income. How do we talk about GDP without addressing people's income? And I think this is an important point. And we just had a paper written called Measuring Wellbeing, How to Move Beyond GDP by Rutger Hoekstra. It's brilliant. And I have put the link in the chat. And the point basically is that we need to harmonize what already exists, and that GDP is actually this incredible kind of compilation of that everyone uses the same measurement. I mean, that's incredible. But obviously it just measures the wrong thing. So we need to figure out how to move beyond GDP as the measurement and actually integrate other metrics into that kind of universal metric. And so I will put a link to a webinar that's going to dive a lot deeper into this topic into the chat in a second. And I'm going to ask Juliet if you would please open your mic and share with us.
Great, thank you. I'm Juliet Michelson. I work for a charity called Economy. We exist to help people and people far from power join conversations about the economy and ultimately shape it. But in a previous life, I did a lot of advocacy around wellbeing economy. So really excited to see the report, and so I came up with two questions. The two of the things that I think I never kind of satisfactorily grappled with. So one of them is how you avoid well-being being interpreted as the sort of wellness frame, the sort of yoga, healthy eating, and which I think was always helped it be dismissed as, okay, this is not a kind of suitable goal for the economy as a whole. And then similarly, kind of one of the key attacks that I'm not sure I ever kind of worked out exactly how to deal with well is the fact that the economy, as currently designed, does depend on growth. And as we are seeing right now, when you take that away, bad things happen. So, you know, how you avoid bringing that sort of fear up that what you're doing is trying to, like, you know, break a system that works.
Yeah. One thing that I can start here, but one thing that Catherine Trebek talks about a lot is the kind of growth that we need, and that we need to grow cooperatives, and we need to grow bike lanes, and we need to grow community gardens. So it's not that we want to stop growth entirely, we're just not growing the right things. And a metaphor that I sort of have been thinking around recently is grass grows where you water it. And so in thinking about how if the grass were the economy, it's only growing in the areas that we're watering it, and those areas happen to be, you know, focused on just these big industries and business. And what really needs to happen is we just need to sort of water and rebalance the system. So not necessarily like burn it to the ground and rebuild it, but we just need to we need to water different places, we need to feed different places, we need to grow other aspects of the economy. I don't know, Rachel, or Dora, if you have anything to add here.
Yeah, I think it speaks a bit to your first point as well, Juliet. I think we need to be quite explicit in talking about the kind of forefronting, you know, the importance of basically of having kind of common ground at the beginning of a message, but I'm always wary that that comes across as it being that we should be kind of somehow, that shouldn't come at the cost of obscuring inequality and being very clear that there's the kind of different impacts and the way in which communities of colour or poorer communities are being impacted by our current economic system, and laying the blame squarely on this government and the policies that we're kind of talking about, or the economic system. So I guess something around, I think the kind of well-being economy, but mixed with punchy messaging that doesn't, you know, that cannot be kind of, that sort of differentiates it very clearly from the wellness kind of industry. That I think it's a really good point, and it's a really interesting challenge, and I can imagine that does come up time and time again. But I think it's just that we shouldn't, for me, from my perspective, kind of hold back from really highlighting who's benefiting from the current system as it is, and where the specific policies that are leading to the outcomes that we're seeing, you know, of society.
The only thing I would add there is just emphasising that point of growth. The growth that we currently have is not benefiting the vast majority of people. I always remember somebody, I'm from the Northeast, so it probably really resonated with me, but somebody on Question Time one time when it was being based in the North, and it was just after the financial crash in those few years afterwards, and the politicians were talking about growth, and this woman just went, "That's your GDP growth, that's not ours." And it was so kind of this, you know, stark reality. I could just picture all the money being sucked into the towers in the City of London, as opposed to it actually translating to people's lives, getting, you know, happier and people feeling wealthier. And so I think that's an important thing for us to remember, that growth isn't leading to the shared values and outcomes that we all want in our lives.
Yeah, great. Okay, I only have time for a couple more questions, so I'm going to try to pop through these rather quickly. I'm going to ask Dora this next one from Haley. So have you explored any messaging with ordinary people or people outside our bubbles? Is that a part of the research?
Yeah, I mean, yes, in general, that is like a very essential part of a messaging process, I think. And in the Framing the Economy project, we did have focus groups, we had online polling and surveys. I think, you know, that it was a big budget project, and we haven't been able to do with the well-being specifically, you know, testing messages on well-being economy. We haven't been able to do that so far. I think it's also, though, PERC has a really good guide on their website, which I can share afterwards, about testing an introduction to testing methodologies, and it's very much geared towards like from an absolute shoestring budget to kind of big budget. So in whatever capacity you're organizing or campaigning, even if you're operating with no money at all, there are ways and kind of methods that we can use to just try and get that bit beyond like our bubble. And often actually that person, although it's not a perfect science, but might be someone in your family who has absolutely no interest in well-being economy, or like doesn't is not it's kind of trying to think of where the people are to sort of test some of this stuff out with is one very sort of easy way that does have an impact. But yes, ideally, and in the messaging and framing work that we do at Neon, it's wherever possible we will be running focus groups or doing polling or doing kind of message testing to make sure that we're not talking just to our bubble.
Great.
Thanks, Alice, for sharing that.
Okay, I'm skimming through all these questions. Okay, I'm gonna call on, so we'll do I'm gonna have maybe 2 more questions. Then I'm gonna share a Google Doc where I would love, if you feel comfortable, to input some of your, like what your initiative is that maybe is in line with the wellbeing economy, so we can sort of get a feel for who's here today and what initiatives could help contribute and build more of a power base for a wellbeing economy. So I'll share that. And then we'll also share the guide. This call is recorded and will be shared on YouTube with a link to the guide. We'll also have a blog written with a recap for those that weren't able to attend. So just so that you all are aware of sort of how we will wrap up today, because we've just got 10 minutes left. So 2 more questions. So Bridget from ECG, do you feel comfortable unmuting yourself and asking your question?
Hi, thanks Isabel. Hello everyone. I'm Bridget from Economy for the Common Good, which is an international movement. And if we think of things like the donut economics as the kind of the big picture and the train tracks for where we want to get to, ECG has kind of models and tools, which is like the sort of train for how to get us there. My sort of questions about how can we collaborate together using our various kind of case studies, practical examples, concepts for offering practical things of what's happening in real locations, locally and regionally, where it's making a difference. And one example is the city of Amsterdam. The city of Amsterdam's doing this big impact project, and in its, if you look at its guide in there, it mentions donut economics, so that's kind of setting the big frame. But it also lists things like common good balance sheet as a way to get there, as a way to measure the impact. ECG also has this concept of the common good product, and that's where citizens could be locally set the 20 key themes, which for them would make a good life, meaningful life. And it's that against which policies should be measured rather than money. And for all of our initiatives, there's really great work, and the We All network produced a wellbeing business guide, which includes lots of these practical examples. And this has come up for me quite pertinently because we're trying to recruit an international PR coordinator. But I'm thinking, well, why are we doing this on our own? Why are we not collaborating and telling the story, which is richer when we're telling it all together rather than just one network? And instead of us creating loads of individual movements, how can we come together more? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think this is what we all sort of tries to do, and it's hard because the system that we have, in order to collaborate really well, it's actually more difficult. So it's sort of about changing the way that we work together. And I think this is actually a beautiful example of a collaboration where we yeah, we each kind of pulled different parts of our work together to host this event. And this sort of now binds these 4 organizations so that moving forward, we have sort of something to work off of together. I think collaboration really helps when there is an initiative or a cause or an intent, right? So it's like, let's go in on a funding bid together, or we want to launch this campaign. Do you want to launch it alongside us? So, you know, from my experience working with We All, which its major aim is to do exactly this, it's very difficult, especially when you don't have a lot of resource and human power. It also is always going to be easier to do it like yourself, kind of in a way. So it's sort of getting out of that framework and getting out of that mindset and saying like, I know I could just do this, but I need to make it more participatory, because that is like the ethos of this organization. And I think part of our goal today was to get more of a feel for the space. So who else is sort of working on this? And actually, with 6 minutes left, I'll leave Dora and Rachel. Do you want to add anything here? Any thoughts? Okay. So yeah, go ahead, Rachel.
Well, no, I think it's probably what you're going to come on to.
Yeah. Do you want to go ahead and introduce?
Sure. And should we just post this this link to the Google Doc in the chat so that people can, you know, people have been sharing so many links in the chat as we've been going, which is fantastic. But Isabel's just shared a Google Doc there, which essentially is a table. So if people want to jump in there and just drop in, you know, the things that people have been sharing, so that more of what was just being said there, you know, the collaboration can start to happen. And yeah, I guess the only thing I would add in response to that question is like, these spaces are exactly the wonderful places where we can come together and kind of, you know, find out who's doing what and who wants to do what and where there is crossover, because I think that that's the key thing, is where there are specific of interventions that people want to make, where they can identify who are the other organizations or people within those organizations who also really want to do that stuff. So as an example of what we've been doing, Positive Money, so in the top of that Google Doc that we've just shared, there's a link to our Tragedy of Growth report, which we launched in May of 2020. And alongside that, we commissioned this YouGov polling exposing that the public were really supportive of having ministers prioritize health and well-being over GDP. So off the back of that work, we're starting to come together with more of the policy experts working in this space. So colleagues of Isabel's at WEAL, people at NEF, people in the Economic Change Unit, we're starting to have conversations together to coalesce around a concerted push in the political space in England. So we're looking at a roundtable later in this year and trying to coalesce cross-party support and push within Parliament. Alongside that, we want to be building the public and grassroots support for this agenda alongside other groups and organisations who are doing this work. So we're looking at organising some citizens' assemblies later in the year on a wellbeing economy and a public petition. So in the hope that this will help people to coalesce around a specific interventions. And I think that's one of the things that you know, wellbeing economy, it's so huge, and it's like, what does that mean? And it means various different things, but what we're trying to do is use this opportunity that we have in what COVID and the climate crisis, the space that is opening up for changing minds as to what's possible and what an economy is for. We think that it's really important that we're driving forward this narrative shift of what an economy is for and what it can be, so that we're changing minds alongside actually pushing. So what does that roadmap look like? You know, what are the policies that we need to change and that we can start to change now, and actually making some interventions in pursuit of that. So if anybody is interested in supporting either the kind of political work we're doing or the public work we're doing, which is obviously closely connected, then please do reach out to Positive Money. And we're working really closely with We All on this work. So you know, reaching out to We All as well, we'll hopefully we'll all be able to get together on that. The aim here is really to stimulate public and political conversation and support for a wellbeing economy. And it's so exciting. It's just so exciting to see all these people on the call and all the different work that's happening. It's so encouraging and exciting, and I hope other people feel filled with kind of warmth and hope and encouragement as we do. Thanks, Isabel.
Yeah, so I love seeing everybody putting their stuff on the Google Doc. That's fantastic, and that's open for you all to use. So please, I'll just put it one more time in the chat if you missed it. But yeah, use each other. Keep a lookout for some follow-up from this event. Oh, and let's share the messaging guide. How about that? So this is the official messaging guide. And it has, like I saw in some of the comments, like a do's and don'ts. So hopefully it answers some of your questions. I will download the chat and review and make sure that in the blog write-up that we do, that we address the questions that weren't answered today. So between Rachel and Dora and I will collaborate and make sure that everyone's questions are answered, and then we'll share through our different networks and make sure that that's emailed to the list of those that that attended the event today. So thank you so much. Yeah, and I just, it's very encouraging to see you all show up in numbers today, and the change is happening. So I appreciate you all being here today. And Dora, do you have any closing thoughts before we go?
No, just thanks a lot. And yeah, look forward to hearing feedback on the guide. Do let us know how you find it.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Have a lovely day.